The crack of a gavel echoed through the dusty streets of Oro Blanco, Arizona, drawing curious onlookers like moths to flame on that scorching summer day in 1885. Eleanor Hayes stood on the makeshift wooden platform outside the jailhouse, her wrists bound with coarse rope that bit into her skin. Her once fine blue dress now tattered and stained with the evidence of her long journey. Her dark honey-colored hair hung limply around her face, partially obscuring the defiant glint in her hazel eyes as Sheriff Dawson announced his intentions to the growing crowd. Next up for auction, this woman, charged with vagrancy. Found sleeping in the livery with no coin to her name and no respectable business in our town, the sheriff called out, his voice carrying across the town square. Bidding starts at $20, the price of her fine and a night in my jail. Eleanor raised her chin despite the humiliation burning through her. She hadn't asked for any of this, the stagecoach robbery that had left her penniless, the desperate trek to find work that had brought her to this God-forsaken mining town. Now she was being auctioned off like cattle, the sheriff's thinly veiled suggestion that whoever paid her fine would own her services clear to everyone gathered. At the edge of the crowd, Benjamin Caldwell shifted uncomfortably. He'd only come to town for supplies before heading back to his modest ranch, 10 miles outside Oro Blanco. The tall cowboy's hand instinctively brushed against the money pouch at his hip, payment for 2 steers he'd sold earlier that day. His deep-set blue eyes narrowed beneath the brim of his worn Stetson as he studied the scene unfolding before him. $20 for a fine piece like that, called out a burly miner from the front of the crowd. I'll give you 25. 30. Shouted another man, his leering gaze making Eleanor shrink back, despite her determination not to show fear. Benjamin watched as the woman's shoulders stiffened, her hands clenching into fists. There was something in her stance, pride in the face of degradation, that stirred something within him. Before he could second-guess himself, he stepped forward. $50, he called out, his deep voice cutting through the rabble of shouted bids. The crowd quieted, turning to look at the tall cowboy with the sun-weathered face. Sheriff Dawson's bushy eyebrows rose with interest at the unexpectedly high bid. $50 from Mr. Caldwell, the sheriff announced, sounding pleased. Anyone care to top that? The silence stretched as the other men calculated whether the woman was worth that much coin. Eleanor's eyes found Benjamin's, confusion and wariness evident in her gaze. $50 going once, going twice. Sheriff Dawson paused dramatically, scanning the crowd. When no one spoke up, he brought the gavel down with a resounding crack. Sold to Benjamin Caldwell. As Benjamin approached the platform, he could feel the weight of the woman's stare. He climbed the steps and handed the sheriff the money, his jaw tight with barely contained disgust at the proceedings. "She's all yours, Caldwell," Dawson said with a wink that made Benjamin's stomach turn. "Make sure she earns her keep." Benjamin ignored the comment and turned to Eleanor. Up close, he could see the exhaustion etched in the fine lines around her eyes, the vulnerability she fought to hide. Without a word, he pulled a small knife from his belt and cut the ropes binding her wrists. "Thank you," she whispered, rubbing the raw skin where the ropes had chafed. "Follow me," he said quietly, offering nothing more as he turned and stepped down from the platform. Eleanor hesitated for only a moment before following him, conscious of the disappointed mutters from the crowd as they dispersed. She had no reason to trust this stranger, but he just spent $50 to free her from what would certainly have been a far worse fate. Benjamin led her to where his horse was hitched outside the general store. The dappled gray gelding snorted softly as they approached. Benjamin loaded his recently purchased supplies into his saddlebags before turning to face Eleanor. "Miss, I want to make something clear," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I paid that fine because what was happening back there wasn't right. I'm not expecting anything in return." Eleanor studied his face, searching for any sign of deception. "Then why?" Benjamin shifted uncomfortably. "My mother raised me better than to stand by and watch something like that." He hesitated before adding, "I've got a small ranch outside of town. You can stay in the spare room tonight, get cleaned up, have a proper meal. Tomorrow I can take you wherever you want to go." Eleanor's pride warred with practicality. She had nowhere to go, no money, and no prospects. This man seemed decent enough, and one night of safety was better than none. "I'm Eleanor Hayes," she said finally, offering her name as if it were all she had to give, which in truth it was. "Benjamin Caldwell," he replied with a slight nod. "Most folks call me Ben." He offered her a hand up onto his horse, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it, settling behind him on the saddle. As they rode out of town, Eleanor felt the stares of the townsfolk following them, but she kept her head high, refusing to show how deeply the day's events had shaken her. The ride to Benjamin's ranch took nearly 2 hours, the landscape gradually shifting from the dusty streets of Oro Blanco to rolling hills dotted with cacti and scrub brush. They rode in silence most of the way, each lost in their own thoughts. For Eleanor, the rhythm of the horse's gait and the solid presence of the man seated before her lulled her into an exhausted daze. When they finally crested a small ridge, Benjamin's ranch came into view below. It was modest, a small one-story cabin with a separate barn and corral where a handful of horses and cattle grazed. A stream cut through the property, lined with cottonwood trees that provided welcome shade. "It's not much," Benjamin said, breaking the long silence, "but it's home." "It's beautiful," Eleanor replied honestly. After weeks of hard travel and uncertain shelter, the little homestead looked like paradise. Benjamin helped her down from the horse when they reached the cabin. Eleanor winced as her feet touched the ground, her legs stiff from the long ride. He noticed her discomfort but pretended not to, offering her the dignity of not calling attention to her weakness. The cabin's interior was simple but clean. A main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a cast iron stove in one corner and a rough-hewn table with 4 chairs in another. 2 doors led off the main room, one to Benjamin's bedroom and another to the promised spare room. "The pump's out back for water," he explained, moving to stoke the fire in the stove. "I'll heat some for you to wash up. There's a tub in the spare room." Eleanor stood awkwardly in the center of the room, suddenly aware of how filthy she must look and smell after days on the road. "Mr. Caldwell, I don't know how to thank you for what you did today." He glanced up at her, his expression unreadable. "No need for thanks, and it's just Ben." While Ben prepared a simple meal of beans and cornbread, Eleanor took advantage of the promised bath. The spare room was small but tidy, with a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a copper tub that she filled with the heated water Ben had provided. The simple act of washing away the dust and grime of the road felt like heaven, and by the time she'd changed into the clean shirt and trousers Ben had lent her, apologizing for having no women's clothing, she felt more human than she had in weeks. When she emerged from the room, hair damp but clean and rolled up at the nape of her neck, Ben was setting 2 plates on the table. He glanced up, and for a brief moment, something flickered in his eyes before he quickly looked away. "Hope you're hungry," he said, gesturing to the modest meal. "Starving," Eleanor admitted, taking a seat. "Thank you for this." They ate in companionable silence at first, both focused on satisfying their hunger. Eventually, Ben cleared his throat. "If you don't mind my asking, what brought you to Oro Blanco alone?" "It's not exactly a place women travel to willingly." Eleanor set down her fork, considering how much to share. I was traveling to Tucson to take a position as a schoolteacher. The stagecoach was robbed 3 days out from Oro Blanco. The bandits took everything, my money, my trunk with all my possessions. She sighed. I walked to town hoping to find work or assistance, but you found Sheriff Dawson instead, Ben finished grimly. He's got a reputation for that kind of thing. Arresting women for vagrancy when they are just down on their luck. What would have happened if you hadn't? She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Ben's face darkened. Nothing good. The men who were bidding on you aren't known for their gentlemanly behavior. A heavy silence fell between them. Finally, Eleanor spoke again. I had references, credentials from the normal school in St. Louis, all lost now. Tucson's still needing teachers, I'd wager, Ben said. I could take you there once you've rested. It's about 3 days' ride. Eleanor shook her head. I couldn't ask that of you. You've already done too much. It's no trouble. I need to head that way soon anyhow, he lied smoothly. In truth, he had no business in Tucson, but something about this woman's plight had stirred his conscience. After supper, Ben insisted that Eleanor take the bed in the spare room while he made do with a bedroll by the fireplace. Too exhausted to argue, she gratefully accepted and soon fell into the deepest sleep she'd had in weeks. The next morning, Eleanor woke to the smell of coffee and bacon. She dressed quickly in the borrowed clothes, which were far too large but clean, and joined Ben in the main room. He was just setting plates on the table, his hair damp from his own morning wash. "Good morning," she said, suddenly self-conscious about her appearance. Ben looked up, a hint of a smile softening his typically solemn expression. "Morning, hope you slept well." "Better than I have in a very long time," she admitted. Over breakfast, Ben explained that he needed to tend to his livestock before they could make any plans for her journey to Tucson. Eleanor immediately offered to help. "I grew up on a farm in Missouri," she explained when he looked surprised. "I'm no stranger to chores." Ben accepted her offer with a nod, and soon they fell into an easy rhythm, working side by side. Eleanor helped feed the chickens and collect eggs while Ben tended to the horses and cattle. By midday, she'd proven herself both capable and hardworking, earning a newfound respect from the quiet rancher. As they sat in the shade of a cottonwood tree eating a simple lunch of leftover cornbread and jerky, Eleanor found herself studying her rescuer. Ben Caldwell wasn't handsome in the conventional sense, but there was something compelling about his weathered features, the straight line of his nose, the small scar that cut through his right eyebrow, the way the sun had etched fine lines at the corners of his blue eyes. He caught her looking and raised an eyebrow questioningly. "Sorry," she said, flushing slightly. "I was just thinking that I know almost nothing about you, despite your kindness." Ben took a slow sip of water from his canteen. "Not much to tell, been ranching here for 5 years. Came west after the war looking for something different." "You fought in the war?" she asked. He nodded, his expression closing off slightly. "Confederate cavalry, not something I care to dwell on." Eleanor sensed his discomfort and changed the subject. "How did you end up in Arizona territory?" The tension in his shoulders eased slightly. "Worked cattle drives in Texas for a while, made enough to buy this place when I got tired of the trail." He hesitated, then added, "It was supposed to be for me and my wife, but she died of fever before we could make the journey." "I'm sorry," Eleanor said softly, understanding better now the solitude of his existence. Ben merely nodded, rising to his feet. "We should finish up if you're set on reaching Tucson." As they walked back to the cabin, Eleanor made a decision. "If it's all the same to you, I thought perhaps I might stay another day or two." When Ben looked surprised, she hurriedly added, "Just to regain my strength before the journey. I could help around the ranch to earn my keep." The truth was, She wasn't ready to face another uncertain future just yet. Here, at least, she felt safe. Ben studied her for a moment, then nodded. Stay as long as you need. One day stretched into 3, then a week. Eleanor proved herself invaluable around the ranch, cooking meals that were far more palatable than Ben's basic fare, mending clothes and helping with the daily chores. For his part, Ben found himself growing accustomed to her presence, enjoying the sound of her humming as she worked and their conversations over evening meals. On her 8th day at the ranch, disaster struck. Ben was repairing a section of fence in the north pasture when his horse was spooked by a rattlesnake. The animal reared unexpectedly, throwing Ben hard to the ground. A searing pain shot through his leg as he landed, and he knew immediately that something was broken. Eleanor, who had been hanging laundry behind the cabin, heard his shouts and ran to find him. She discovered Ben trying to drag himself toward the cabin, his face pale with pain, his right leg bent at an unnatural angle. "Don't move," she commanded, kneeling beside him. "I need to get help." "No time," Ben gasped through gritted teeth. "Need to set it before the swelling gets worse." Eleanor's mind raced. The nearest doctor was in Oro Blanco, hours away. Ben was right, the leg needed immediate attention. Drawing on half-remembered lessons from her father, who had served as a field medic during the war, she helped Ben back to the cabin, supporting his weight as he hopped on his good leg. Inside, she laid him on his bed and cut away the leg of his trousers to reveal a clean break in his shin, thankfully not protruding through the skin. With Ben's terse instructions and her own determination, she managed to set the bone and create a splint using wooden slats and torn bedsheets. The ordeal left them both exhausted. As night fell, Eleanor sat beside Ben's bed, wiping his brow with a cool cloth as fever set in, a common reaction to such trauma. In his delirium, Ben mumbled about the war, about his dead wife Mary, and occasionally about Eleanor herself. "Don't leave," he murmured at one point, his hand finding hers in the darkness. "Please stay." "I'm not going anywhere," she promised, squeezing his fingers gently. For 3 days, Eleanor barely left Ben's side, nursing him through the fever and pain. She tended to his livestock, prepared simple broths and teas, and changed the bandages on his leg. When the fever finally broke on the 4th day, Ben woke to find Eleanor asleep in the chair beside his bed, her head resting on her folded arms at the edge of his mattress. He studied her in the early morning light, the gentle curve of her cheek, the strand of honey-brown hair that had escaped its pins, the dark smudges of exhaustion beneath her eyes. Something shifted in his chest, a feeling he'd thought long buried with Mary. Eleanor stirred, sensing his gaze, and lifted her head. Relief flooded her features when she saw him awake and lucid. "The fever's broken," she said, pressing her palm to his forehead. "How's the pain?" "Manageable," he replied, though the throbbing in his leg suggested otherwise. "You've been taking care of everything," she nodded. "The animals are fed, the chickens are laying well, and I managed to repair that shirt you tore last week." Her attempt at lightness didn't quite mask the concern in her eyes. "You had me worried. I'm sorry for the trouble." "It's no trouble," she said softly. "You saved me, remember. Consider this partial repayment." As the days passed, Ben's leg began to heal, but his mobility remained severely limited. Eleanor took over the running of the ranch, proving herself more capable than either of them had expected. She learned to milk the cow, mend fences, and even broke down and cleaned Ben's rifle when tracks suggested a mountain lion was prowling near the livestock. Their evenings were spent in quiet conversation, as Eleanor sat mending or reading aloud from one of the few books Ben owned while he whittled or repaired tack. They learned each other's stories. Eleanor's upbringing as the daughter of a doctor in a small Missouri town. Her decision to become a teacher after her parents died of influenza 3 years earlier. Ben's childhood in Kentucky, his reluctant service in the Confederate cavalry, and his westward journey seeking redemption after the war. "I never wanted to fight," he admitted one evening as the lamp burned low, "but when the call came, every man in my town enlisted. Duty, they called it." His hand stilled on the bridle he was mending. "I saw things, did things I can't take back." It was the first time he'd used the shortened version of her name, and Eleanor felt a curious warmth at the familiarity. "We all have regrets," she said gently. "All we can do is try to be better tomorrow than we were yesterday." Ben's eyes met hers across the room, and something unspoken passed between them, an understanding, a connection deeper than either was ready to acknowledge. By the time Ben's leg had healed enough for him to move about with the aid of a crutch, nearly 6 weeks had passed. The subject of Eleanor's departure for Tucson remained unmentioned, an avoidance that both recognized but neither addressed. It was the arrival of a letter delivered by a passing trader that forced the issue. The trader, Manuel Ortiz, brought supplies and news from Oro Blanco in exchange for some of Eleanor's preserves and a side of beef. "Sheriff's been asking about you, Caldwell," Ortiz mentioned as they loaded his wagon. "And about the lady." He glanced at Eleanor, who was hanging laundry nearby. "Says he's got a letter for her from Tucson." Ben frowned. "Did he say what it was about?" Ortiz shook his head. "Just that it seemed important, came looking for reply from the school board there." That evening, Ben reluctantly broached the subject as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. "We should ride into town tomorrow," he said, not looking at her. "See about that letter." Eleanor's hand stilled on the shirt she was mending. "I suppose we should." The silence stretched between them, heavy with words unsaid. Ben finally said, turning to face her, "These past weeks have been a blessing," she finished for him. "You saved my life, Ben, I won't forget that." "You saved mine too," he replied quietly. "And not just when I broke my leg." Eleanor understood what he meant. Before her arrival, Ben had been existing rather than living, going through the motions of life without truly engaging with it. Her presence had awakened something in him he'd thought long dead. The next day, they rode into Oro Blanco together, Ben still moving stiffly, but insisting he was well enough for the journey. Eleanor wore one of her own dresses that she'd mended and altered, and had pinned her hair up neatly beneath a borrowed bonnet. The transformation from the bedraggled woman Ben had first encountered to this composed, dignified lady was striking. The townsfolk stared as they made their way to the sheriff's office, whispers following in their wake. Eleanor held her head high, refusing to show how much their scrutiny affected her. Sheriff Dawson's eyebrows rose when they entered his office. Well, the vagrant and her savior return." He leaned back in his chair, openly appraising Eleanor. "You're looking considerably improved, Miss Hayes." "I understand you have a letter for me," Eleanor said coolly, ignoring the sheriff's insinuating tone. Dawson nodded, reaching into his desk drawer. "Came about 2 weeks ago, from the Tucson School Board." He handed her an envelope, watching with undisguised curiosity as she opened it. Eleanor scanned the contents, her expression carefully neutral. "It seems they've been holding the teaching position for me," she said, looking up at Ben. "Apparently my references arrived separately from St. Louis and were quite satisfactory. They're expecting me to arrive by the end of the month." Ben nodded, his face betraying nothing of the sudden hollowness he felt inside. "That's good news." Sheriff Dawson looked between them, a knowing smirk playing at his lips. "Thought you might have decided on a different position by now," he said, his meaning clear. Caldwell here paid a pretty penny for you." Ben's hand clenched into a fist at his side. "You do well to watch your tongue, Sheriff," he said, his voice dangerously soft. Dawson held up his hands in mock surrender. "No offense meant, just making conversation." They left the sheriff's office quickly after that, both shaken by the encounter. As they prepared to return to the ranch, Ben insisted on stopping at the general store. "You'll need supplies for your journey to Tucson," he explained, not meeting Eleanor's eyes, "and proper clothes." Eleanor wanted to protest, to tell him she wasn't sure she wanted to go to Tucson anymore, but the words stuck in her throat. What future could she possibly have on a small ranch with a man who had never indicated he wanted her to stay permanently? Better to leave with dignity than overstay her welcome. Ben purchased fabric for 2 new dresses, a sturdy pair of boots in Eleanor's size, and various necessities for travel. His generosity brought tears to her eyes, which she quickly blinked away. The ride back to the ranch was mostly silent, both lost in their own thoughts. When they arrived, the place that had come to feel like home to Eleanor now seemed transient, a temporary haven she would soon have to leave. That night, as they sat at the table eating the rabbit stew Eleanor had prepared, Ben finally spoke of what had been weighing on his mind. "I could take you to Tucson next week," he said, staring into his bowl. "The stage would be faster, but after what happened last time—" "Ben," Eleanor interrupted softly, "what if I don't want to go to Tucson?" He looked up sharply, hope and confusion warring in his eyes. "The letter is an opportunity, yes, but maybe not the one I want anymore." She set down her spoon, gathering her courage. "These past weeks have been the happiest of my life, despite everything. I've found purpose here and—" She hesitated, then continued more quietly, "and I've found you." The silence that followed seemed endless. Ben's face revealed nothing as he processed her words. "Elle," he finally said, his voice rough with emotion, "I have nothing to offer you. This ranch barely sustains one person, let alone 2. I'm 10 years your senior with nothing but a failed marriage and war memories to my name." "That's not true," she countered. "You have honor and kindness and a strength that amazes me daily." She reached across the table, her fingers stopping just short of touching his. "I'm not asking for promises. I'm just asking if you want me to stay." Ben looked down at her hand, so close to his own. Slowly, deliberately, he bridged the gap, covering her fingers with his calloused palm. "More than anything," he admitted, the words seeming to be pulled from somewhere deep inside him. "But I need you to be sure. Teaching is what you trained for, what you came west to do." Eleanor turned her hand beneath his, linking their fingers together. "I can teach here. There are families within riding distance with children who need education. I could start a small school." The possibility hung between them, fragile as a soap bubble. Ben's thumb traced circles on the back of her hand as he considered. "It wouldn't be easy," he warned. A smile tugged at the corner of Eleanor's mouth. "Nothing worthwhile ever is." Ben rose from his chair, still holding her hand, and drew her to her feet. Standing before her, he seemed suddenly uncertain, a vulnerability in his eyes she'd rarely glimpsed. "I never thought I'd feel this way again," he confessed, his free hand coming up to brush a strand of hair from her cheek. "After Mary died, I figured that part of my life was over. And now—" Eleanor whispered, hardly daring to breathe as his fingers lingered against her skin. "Now I find myself hoping for things I've no right to hope for." His blue eyes searched hers. "I'm not a man of pretty words, Elle, but if you'll have me, I'll spend every day trying to be worthy of you." In answer, Eleanor rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but quickly deepened as Ben's arms encircled her waist, drawing her against him. When they finally parted, both breathing heavily, Eleanor rested her forehead against his chest. "Is that a yes?" Ben asked, a rare note of humor in his voice. Eleanor laughed, the sound bright in the quiet cabin. "That's a yes." The next day they rode back to Oro Blanco, this time with a different purpose. Ben insisted on doing things properly, which meant obtaining a marriage license from the town clerk and finding a minister to perform the ceremony. The clerk raised his eyebrows when they stated their intention, glancing between them with obvious curiosity. "This the same woman Sheriff Dawson had up for auction a couple months back?" he asked Ben. "This is Miss Eleanor Hayes," Ben replied firmly. "Soon to be Mrs. Eleanor Caldwell. Any other questions?" The clerk wisely kept his thoughts to himself as he filled out the necessary paperwork. Finding a minister proved more challenging. The nearest church was in Bisbee, nearly 50 miles away. However, luck was on their side. The circuit riding preacher, Reverend Johnson, was scheduled to be in Oro Blanco the following Sunday. "We could wait," Ben suggested as they left the clerk's office. "Do it proper with the Reverend." Eleanor squeezed his hand. "I'd like that." They spent the 5 days until Sunday in a state of nervous anticipation. Ben worked from dawn to dusk, preparing the ranch, repairing the roof that had been leaking, building a proper washstand for the spare room that would now be theirs together, and clearing land for the expanded garden Eleanor had been planning. For her part, Eleanor sewed frantically, turning the fabric Ben had purchased into a simple but elegant blue dress for the wedding. In the evenings, they sat together planning their future, discussing the possibility of building a small schoolhouse on the property, considering which crops might supplement their income, and talking about the improvements needed if they were to start a family someday. That last topic brought a flush to Eleanor's cheeks and a tender smile to Ben's lips. Neither had explicitly discussed children, but the possibility hung in the air between them, a shared hope for the future. Sunday dawned clear and bright. Ben had arranged for them to be married at noon, after the regular church service held in the town's small meeting hall. He left early to take care of a few final errands, promising to meet Eleanor at the hall at the appointed time. Eleanor dressed carefully in her new blue dress, pinning her hair in a simple but elegant style, and adding the pearl earrings that had been her mother's, the one possession the stagecoach robbers had overlooked, as she'd been wearing them during the holdup. She studied her reflection in the small mirror Ben had hung in the bedroom, hardly recognizing the woman who looked back at her calm, confident, and unmistakably happy. As she prepared to leave for town, a knock came at the cabin door. Puzzled they rarely had visitors, Eleanor opened it to find Sheriff Dawson standing on the porch, hat in hand. "Miss Hayes," he said, an unpleasant smile spreading across his face. "Or should I say, the soon-to-be Mrs. Caldwell," Eleanor stiffened. "What can I do for you, Sheriff?" Dawson leaned against the doorframe, blocking her exit. "I was just wondering if you'd given any thought to the fact that your fiancé essentially purchased you. Some might call that questionable." "Ben paid my fine," Eleanor corrected coldly. "He saved me from an unjust situation that you created," the sheriff shrugged. "Matter of perspective, I suppose. Still, it does make one wonder what else Mr. Caldwell might be hiding." He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. "Like this warrant from Tennessee." Eleanor's blood ran cold. "What warrant?" "Seems your Benjamin Caldwell deserted from the Confederate Army in '64. That's still a crime in some states." Dawson examined the paper with exaggerated interest. Interesting timing, him showing up here with a new name right after the desertion. "That's ridiculous," Eleanor protested, though doubt had begun to creep in. Ben had always been vague about his war service and his journey west. Even if that were true, it was over 20 years ago. "Some crimes don't fade with time," Dawson said, "but I'm a reasonable man." I could be persuaded to lose this warrant. Eleanor understood his meaning immediately. What do you want? That teaching position in Tucson sounds mighty fine. You take it, leave Caldwell be, and this warrant disappears. And if I refuse, Dawson's smile turned predatory. Then I arrest your intended before the wedding, and he spends his honeymoon in my jail awaiting extradition to Tennessee. Eleanor's mind raced. She had no way of knowing if the warrant was genuine or if this was just another of Dawson's schemes. But she couldn't take the risk, not with Ben's freedom at stake. I need time to think, she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. Dawson nodded, seeming pleased with himself. You've got until noon. I'll be at the meeting hall. He touched the brim of his hat in mock courtesy. Choose wisely, Miss Hayes. After he left, Eleanor sank into a chair, her hands trembling. Could Ben really be a deserter? He'd mentioned joining the Confederate cavalry, fighting in battles she recognized from her father's accounts of the war, but he'd never specified how his service had ended. The war's final year had been chaotic. Perhaps he'd simply gone home when it became clear the South was losing. Or perhaps Sheriff Dawson was lying, manufacturing this threat to separate them for his own twisted reasons. Eleanor paced the cabin, weighing her options. She could tell Ben about the sheriff's visit, but what if the warrant was real? She couldn't bear to see him arrested on their wedding day. She could agree to Dawson's terms, break Ben's heart by leaving, but ensure his freedom. Or she could call the sheriff's bluff and hope he was lying. As the hour of the wedding approached, Eleanor made her decision. She quickly packed a small bag with essential items, wrote a brief note that revealed nothing of Dawson's threat, but simply stated she'd realized she couldn't stay, and left it on the table. With tears streaming down her face, she saddled Ben's second horse, the gentle mare he'd been teaching her to ride, and headed not toward Oro Blanco, but east, away from both the town and Tucson. She would go neither to her wedding nor to the teaching position. Instead, she would find somewhere new to start over, somewhere Sheriff Dawson couldn't use her against Ben. Meanwhile, in Oro Blanco, Ben waited anxiously at the meeting hall. Noon came and went with no sign of Eleanor. As the minutes ticked by, his concern grew. It wasn't like her to be late, especially for something as important as their wedding. Sheriff Dawson approached, feigning sympathy. Looks like you might have been stood up, Caldwell. Ben ignored the comment, his worry mounting. Something's wrong. Elle wouldn't just not show. Women can be fickle, Dawson suggested. Maybe she had second thoughts about marrying a man who bought her at auction. The words hit their mark. Ben's jaw tightened, but doubt flickered in his eyes. Had Eleanor reconsidered? Had she realized she could do better than a struggling rancher with a broken-down cabin and too many memories? Unable to bear the pitying glances from the townsfolk who had gathered to witness the ceremony, Ben left the meeting hall. He mounted his horse and rode hard for the ranch, praying he'd find Eleanor there, perhaps delayed by some minor emergency. The sight of the note on the table struck him like a physical blow. He read it once, twice, unable to comprehend that Eleanor had simply changed her mind, had simply left without explanation after everything they'd shared. In a daze, Ben noticed that her new dress was gone, as were a few of her personal items. The mare was missing from the corral. The evidence was clear. Eleanor had chosen to leave. For 3 days, Ben barely ate or slept. He moved through his chores mechanically, his mind constantly returning to the question of what had gone wrong. Had he misread her feelings? Had she been pretending affection out of gratitude or obligation? The thought was unbearable. On the 4th day after Eleanor's disappearance, a visitor arrived at the ranch. Manuel Ortiz, the trader who regularly traveled between the settlements in the area. Caldwell, Ortiz greeted him, dismounting from his wagon. Thought you'd want to know I saw your lady friend in Das Cabes's 2 days ago. Ben's head snapped up. Is she all right? Ortiz nodded. Seemed well enough, though troubled. She was asking about work, somewhere to stay. When I mentioned I knew you, she got real quiet, then asked me not to tell you where she was. He shrugged apologetically, which I guess I just did. Did she say why she left? Ben asked, desperate for answers. No, but Ortiz hesitated. There was something strange. Sheriff Dawson was there too, talking to some men about a prisoner transport to Tennessee. He seemed mighty pleased with himself. Ben's blood ran cold as the pieces began to fall into place. Tennessee, where his original regiment had been mustered. Where he'd been born Benjamin Cooper before taking his mother's maiden name after the war. That son of a bitch, Ben muttered, understanding dawning. He found out. Ortiz looked confused. Found out what? But Ben was already striding toward the cabin. I need to find her, he said over his shoulder, before Dawson does. Within the hour, Ben had packed supplies and saddled his horse. If Eleanor was in Das Cabes's, he could reach her in a day's hard riding. He had no plan beyond finding her, explaining the truth, and hoping she would understand. The truth he should have shared from the beginning, that he had indeed deserted the Confederate Army in early 1865. Not out of cowardice, but conscience. After witnessing the slaughter at Franklin and Nashville, unable to reconcile the increasingly desperate Confederate cause with his own moral compass, he had left his regiment. He changed his name not to escape punishment, but to start fresh in a land where a man could be judged by his actions rather than his past. The ride to Das Cabes's was punishing, the summer sun beating down mercilessly as Ben pushed his horse harder than was wise. By the time he reached the small mining settlement, dusk was falling, casting long shadows between the scattered buildings. The town consisted of little more than a general store, a saloon, and a handful of homes clustered around the mines. Ben began his search at the boarding house, a 2-story structure at the edge of town. The proprietress, a stern-faced widow named Mrs. Blackwood, regarded him suspiciously when he inquired after Eleanor. I don't know any Eleanor Hayes, she said, beginning to close the door. Please, Ben urged, his desperation evident. She's about this tall, honey-brown hair, hazel eyes. She might be using a different name. Mrs. Blackwood hesitated, then reluctantly nodded. There's a young woman matching that description staying here, calls herself Emma Harrison. Arrived 3 days ago, paid for a week's lodging. Relief flooded through Ben. Is she here now? She took a position at the school, helping the teacher there. Won't be back until evening. Mrs. Blackwood's eyes narrowed. Are you trouble for her? Because she seems like a decent sort, and we don't abide men causing problems for women in this town. No, madam, Ben assured her. She's my fiancée. There's been a misunderstanding, one I need to clear up. Something in his earnest tone must have convinced the widow, for her expression softened slightly. She's due back around 7. You can wait in the parlor if you like. The next 2 hours were among the longest of Ben's life. He sat rigidly in an uncomfortable chair in Mrs. Blackwood's front parlor, rehearsing what he would say to Eleanor when she arrived. How could he explain his past without sounding like he was making excuses? How could he convince her that whatever Sheriff Dawson had told her was only part of the truth? At precisely 7 o'clock, the front door opened. Ben rose to his feet as Eleanor stepped into the hallway, removing a shawl from her shoulders. She hadn't seen him yet, was speaking quietly to Mrs. Blackwood, who had gone to greet her. He said softly. She froze, her face draining of color as she turned toward his voice. Ben, how did you? Ortiz told me he saw you here. Ben took a tentative step forward. We need to talk, please. Mrs. Blackwood looked between them. Everything all right, Miss Harrison? Eleanor hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Yes, Mrs. Blackwood. This is an old friend. We'll speak in the parlor if that's acceptable." The widow nodded, though she cast a warning glance at Ben before retreating to the kitchen, leaving the parlor door conspicuously ajar. For a long moment, Ben and Eleanor simply looked at each other across the room. She appeared thinner than she had just days earlier, with dark circles beneath her eyes that matched his own. "Why did you come?" Eleanor finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you leave?" Ben countered. "Without a real explanation, without giving me a chance to." "To what?" she interrupted. "To confirm what Sheriff Dawson told me. That you deserted during the war, that you're living under an assumed name, that you could be arrested and sent to Tennessee to face charges." Ben's shoulders slumped. "So he did threaten you with that?" "He showed me a warrant," Eleanor said. "He said if I didn't leave you, he'd arrest you on our wedding day." Her composure cracked, tears filling her eyes. "I couldn't let that happen, Ben. I couldn't be the reason you lost your freedom." Ben crossed the room in 3 strides, stopping just short of touching her. "So you sacrificed your happiness for mine." It wasn't a question, but a statement filled with wonder and regret. "Was it true?" she asked, searching his face. "Are you a deserter?" Ben nodded slowly. "Yes." "But not the way Dawson made it sound." He gestured to the settee. "Will you sit? Let me explain." Eleanor hesitated, then nodded, sinking onto the edge of the settee. Ben sat beside her, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "My name was Benjamin Cooper," he began. "I enlisted in the Confederate cavalry in '62, like most men my age in Kentucky. I believed in states' rights, in defending home and hearth, all the things they told us we were fighting for." He stared down at his hands, calloused and scarred from years of hard work. "By '64, it was clear we were losing. After Nashville, my regiment was in tatters. Men were starving, dying of disease more than bullets, and the orders." He shook his head. "They wanted us to burn civilian homes, destroy crops, punish anyone suspected of Union sympathy." Eleanor listened silently. As Ben described the moment he'd decided he could no longer follow such orders, the night he'd been commanded to torch a farmhouse where a widow and her children lived because her brother had joined the Union Army. "I refused," he said simply. "My captain said he'd have me shot for insubordination. That night I took my horse and rode west, never looked back." He met her eyes steadily. "I'm not proud of deserting, Elle, but I couldn't be part of what the war had become by then." "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked softly. "At first because I barely knew you. Then because I was afraid of what you'd think." His voice roughened. "And finally because I was afraid of losing you." "Instead, you lost me because you didn't tell me," Eleanor pointed out, a hint of her usual spirit returning. "I know. It was wrong, and I'm sorry." Ben reached for her hand, relieved when she didn't pull away. "But Elle, that warrant Dawson showed you can't be real. The charges against deserters were dropped after the war as part of the general amnesty. He was bluffing, using my past to separate us." Eleanor's eyes widened as she considered this possibility. "But why would he go to such lengths?" "Because men like Dawson can't stand to lose," Ben said grimly. "I embarrassed him by outbidding his cronies for you, by treating you with respect instead of as property to be auctioned. This was his revenge." Eleanor's hand tightened around Ben's as the full implication sank in. "So I left for nothing. I hurt us both because of his lie." "You left to protect me," Ben corrected gently. "That tells me everything I need to know about your heart, Elle." Tears spilled down Eleanor's cheeks. "I've been so miserable without you. These past days have been." "I know," Ben murmured, finally giving in to the urge to pull her into his arms. "For me too." They clung to each other in Mrs. Blackwood's formal parlor, oblivious to the widow's occasional concerned glances through the partially open door. When they finally separated, Ben cupped Eleanor's face in his hands. "Come home," he whispered. "Come back to the ranch. We'll face Dawson together if we have to, but I'm not hiding anymore and I'm not losing you again." Eleanor hesitated. "Are you sure? If he does try to arrest you, then we'll fight it legally. I have friends in Tucson who can help, men who understand the war's aftermath better than a corrupt sheriff in a backwater town." Ben smiled slightly. "Besides, I've been doing some thinking. Maybe it's time I reclaimed my real name. Benjamin Cooper has nothing to be ashamed of anymore." The next morning, Eleanor once again, using her real name, settled her account with Mrs. Blackwood and bid farewell to the schoolmistress who had briefly employed her. By noon, she and Ben were on the trail back to Oro Blanco, riding side by side rather than sharing a mount as they had that first day. They made camp that night beneath a stand of cottonwoods, the stars brilliant in the clear desert sky above them. Wrapped in Ben's embrace beside the small fire, Eleanor felt a peace she'd thought lost forever. "I was thinking," Ben said, his voice a low rumble against her back. "We never did get properly married." Eleanor turned in his arms to face him. "Are you proposing again, Mr. Caldwell? Or should I say, Mr. Cooper?" The firelight caught the smile that spread across his face. "I suppose I am, Miss Hayes, though I hope for a better outcome this time." "Well then," she replied, her heart so full it felt it might burst, "I accept." Again. They reached Oro Blanco the following afternoon. Instead of heading straight to the ranch, Ben directed their horses toward the sheriff's office, his jaw set with determination. "Are you sure about this?" Eleanor asked as they dismounted. Ben nodded grimly. "Time to end Dawson's games once and for all." Sheriff Dawson looked up in surprise when they entered his office together. His eyes narrowed as he took in their united front. "Well, well," he drawled, leaning back in his chair. "The prodigal bride returns, and here I thought you'd taken my advice about that teaching position." "Your advice," Eleanor said coldly, "was based on a lie. There is no valid warrant for Ben's arrest." Dawson's gaze shifted to Ben. "Is that what he told you? Convenient." "Show us the warrant," Ben challenged. "The real one, not whatever forgery you used to frighten Eleanor." The sheriff's hesitation was brief but telling. "That's official business, Caldwell, not something I'm obliged to share with a civilian." "Then I suggest you wire the authorities in Tennessee," Ben said evenly. "Ask them if they're still pursuing charges against Benjamin Cooper for desertion in 1865. "I'll wait." Dawson's expression hardened. "You're mighty confident for a man admitting to desertion." "Because I know the law better than you seem to," Ben replied. President Johnson's proclamation of amnesty in 1865 pardoned all Confederate soldiers, including deserters. Any warrant from before that date is invalid, and no new warrants have been issued since. The sheriff's face flushed with anger. "You think you're clever, don't you? Coming in here, challenging me in my own office." "I think I'm tired of you abusing your authority," Ben said quietly. "First with Eleanor, now with these false threats against me. It stops today." Dawson rose from his chair, his hand drifting toward the gun at his hip. "You threatening an officer of the law, Caldwell?" "No," came a new voice from the doorway. "But I might be." They all turned to see Judge Harmon, the circuit judge who served the 5 counties in the region, standing in the doorway. The elderly man's stern gaze fixed on Sheriff Dawson. "Judge," Dawson said, his hand moving away from his weapon. "Didn't expect you in town today." "Clearly," the judge replied dryly. "I couldn't help overhearing your conversation. Something about an invalid warrant." Ben stepped forward. "Judge Harmon, I'm Benjamin Caldwell, though I was born Benjamin Cooper. Sheriff Dawson has been using my past as a Confederate deserter to harass me and Miss Hayes." The judge's bushy eyebrows rose. "Is that so? Well, Mr. Caldwell or Cooper, you're quite correct about President Johnson's amnesty. No valid warrants exist for Confederate deserters unless they committed other crimes. He turned his gaze to Dawson. Sheriff, I'd like to see this warrant you claim to have. Dawson's face had gone pale. It's not here at present, Your Honor. It's being verified. I see, the judge said, his tone making it clear he didn't believe a word. Then I suggest you cease making claims about it until such verification occurs. And if I hear of you using your position to threaten or coerce citizens of this county again, you'll find yourself looking for new employment. Is that clear? The sheriff nodded stiffly, his humiliation evident in his rigid posture and clenched jaw. Now, Judge Harmon continued, turning to Ben and Eleanor, I understand there was to be a wedding recently that didn't come to pass due to these irregularities. Yes, Your Honor, Eleanor confirmed, her hand finding Ben's. The judge smiled for the first time, the expression transforming his severe features. Well, as it happens, I'm authorized to perform marriages in this territory. If you're still of a mind to wed, I'd be honored to officiate. Ben looked at Eleanor, a question in his eyes. She smiled and nodded, squeezing his hand. We'd be grateful, Judge, Ben said. Excellent. Shall we say tomorrow at noon? That should give you time to arrange whatever celebration you desire. The judge's eyes twinkled. And perhaps give Sheriff Dawson here time to compose a wedding gift, perhaps a formal apology. They left the sheriff's office with lighter hearts, the weight of secrets and threats finally lifted from their shoulders. Word of their upcoming wedding and of Sheriff Dawson's humiliation spread quickly through the small town. By that evening, several of the townsfolk had stopped by the ranch to offer congratulations and assistance with the hastily arranged ceremony. The wedding took place as planned the next day, a simple but joyous affair held in the town meeting hall. Eleanor wore her blue dress, adorned with wildflowers Ben had gathered that morning. Ben had shaved carefully and donned his best shirt, looking more nervous and happy than Eleanor had ever seen him. Judge Harmon performed the ceremony with dignity and warmth, pronouncing them husband and wife before the assembled townsfolk. Sheriff Dawson was notably absent, having suddenly found pressing business in a neighboring town. That evening, as they returned to the ranch, their home as husband and wife, Ben lifted Eleanor from the wagon and carried her across the threshold of the cabin, both laughing at the traditional gesture. "Welcome home, Mrs. Cooper," he said, setting her gently on her feet but keeping his arms around her waist. Eleanor smiled up at him, her heart so full she thought it might overflow. "It has a nice ring to it." "It does," he agreed, bending to kiss her with a tenderness that belied the passion she could feel simmering beneath the surface. "Almost as nice as the woman who bears it." Later, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, Eleanor's head pillowed on Ben's chest. She traced the scar that ran along his collarbone, a reminder of the war that had shaped him but no longer defined him. "You ever regret it?" she asked softly. "Coming west, starting over, everything that led you to that day in Oro Blanco." Ben's hand stroked her hair, his voice thoughtful in the darkness. "I've had many regrets in my life, Elle, but none of the paths that led me to you could ever be among them." In the years that followed, the ranch thrived under their joint care. Ben expanded the cattle operation, while Eleanor established a small school that served the children of neighboring ranches and farms. The cabin grew too, with Ben adding rooms as their family expanded, first with the birth of their son William in 1887, followed by twin daughters Sarah and Margaret in 1889. Sheriff Dawson eventually left Oro Blanco for parts unknown, his reputation damaged beyond repair by Judge Harmon's continued scrutiny. His replacement, a young deputy from Tucson, proved to be fair-minded and honest, a welcome change for the growing community. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were asleep, Ben and Eleanor would sit on the porch of their home, watching the sunset paint the desert in gold and crimson just as it had that day when they'd first acknowledged their feelings for each other. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't been at the auction that day?" Ben asked once, his arm around her shoulders as they gazed at the distant mountains. Eleanor considered the question, thinking of all the twists and turns that had led them to this moment: the stagecoach robbery that had left her destitute, Ben's impulsive bid, her nursing him through his injury, their separation and reunion, and finally the life they'd built together. "I believe some things are meant to be," she said finally, resting her head against his shoulder. "Even if the path getting there isn't always what we expect." Ben's arm tightened around her, and he pressed a kiss to her temple. "Then I'm grateful for unexpected paths, Mrs. Cooper. Especially the ones that led me to you." As the last light faded from the sky, they remained there, content in each other's company and in the knowledge that sometimes, even in the wild unpredictability of the frontier, love could find a way to flourish and endure.